That's a really interesting point you bring up because I am across the pond from you and I'm in the United States and people are asking why is the UK acting one way, we're acting another. And President Trump was asked about Epstein and the royal family in recent days and he said that he thinks it's a shame. I think it's very sad. I think it's so bad for the royal family. President Trump has been mentioned in the Epstein files. He has denied any allegations of wrongdoing, but he said that he's an expert in a way because I've been totally exonerated, so I can speak about it. That's how he started his comments on the royal family. And I know obviously the people in Great Britain, they're not a monolith, but what is the general sense of President Trump's reaction to that?
It won't surprise people, and the confidence he has about being exonerated. I mean, it was almost amusing the way he foregrounded his comments with that fact. And we had the hearing last week or the week before with Pam Bondi and the denial of any association. I think the difference is there's a big cultural difference which occurs to me, and that was also seen after the Iraq War, when we went through much more in the way of official investigations and inquiries. There was much more damage to the political class after the Iraq War than was the case in the United States. You could see the consequences of the war in all sorts of ways in the US, but we didn't have these three enormous investigations. One of them, a very public inquiry, which ended up, damaging enormously the reputations of many individuals, not least Tony Blair, the Prime Minister. And so there's a culture, I think, of having these type of investigations, royal commissions very often, or judge-led inquiries, which have become quite voguish in the last few years. Partly, I think, because there's a very clear sense that voters are suspicious of what they read. They're cynical of politicians, and increasingly so. And the idea of judge-led inquiries, of a full investigation, of a public inquiry, is almost thought to detach or remove the evidence and people's suspicions from those who may interfere. Also, there's the case, I mean, compared to the US, and this is an ironic comment given where the United States began in terms of separation of powers and the removal of monarchical authority, there is a sense that the president and the president's appointees can influence judicial outcomes much more than is the case in this country, where there seems to be a much clearer separation of justice and politics and government. Ministers are very clear in their comments this weekend about their inability to say anything concrete about the matter, even though they're being asked about one thing in particular. And this afternoon, the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has written to the Prime Minister to make his view about this very clear. And that is removing Andrew from the line of succession, which in one sense is a symbolic issue because he's only eighth in the line of succession. So it's highly unlikely he would ever become king. He was once briefly second in line of succession. But the very fact that he could be, even though he's not been charged with anything or convicted of anything, is momentum is moving very strongly towards that as an outcome for the government. And that would require, hence Albanese's intervention, the approval of 14 parliaments where the king is, or of countries where the king is also king. So there are 15 realms of King Charles III. UK is one of them. There are 14 others, including Canada and Australia. And they would need to approve this as a measure. Interestingly, Jamaica is currently going through a process of becoming a republic. And it wouldn't surprise me if what's been going on will not accelerate the process of other realms into becoming republics as well.
I'm curious if you could break down the royal reaction for us and maybe talk about how it's different in generations, because I know there was a reported sense that while the Queen was alive, she protected Andrew in a way. I know that he was her escort to the memorial service for Prince Philip in 2022, just weeks after the settlement with Virginia Giuffre. But I want to read King Charles's statement last week. I've learned with the deepest concern the news about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and his suspicion of misconduct in public office. What now follows is the full, fair, and proper process by which this issue is investigated in the appropriate manner and by the appropriate authorities. In this, as I've said before, they have our full and wholehearted support and cooperation. Let me state clearly, the law must take its course. I mean, that just from a human perspective, that's got to be a tough statement to write about a sibling. Tell me if that's true. Talk to us about that royal reaction.
Yes, I mean, it was notable that he didn't mention his brother by name. And we could be faced by the fact that if Andrew is convicted and goes to court, it will be the crown against the brother of the king. So there are all sorts of anomalies and curiosities of a constitutional monarchy which exist, which for Republicans are all absurd. They demonstrate the fundamental ludicrousness of having a hereditary system, of having the royal family exempt from, for example, the Freedom of Information Act, which the government passed at the end of the last century. They are free, by and large, from scrutiny. Their accounts are held away from public gaze. MPs, by convention, are not allowed to discuss the royal family in the House of Commons. So, although it's a constitutional monarchy, and the king acts on the advice of his ministers, the king also appoints his ministers and is absolved from public scrutiny. One of the most compelling conventions in British public life, and certainly in government, is not to embarrass the palace, to keep the monarchy away from politics. The king or the queen reigns but does not rule. That's the key aphorism in terms of what the monarchy does in a modern society. And with the Queen, Elizabeth II, this was a very long reign in which there were various issues, controversies, but by and large, she maintained great public support. And it was very clear when she died how much regard she was held in internationally. And the king, remarkably, I mean, I expected this actually, has maintained a very smooth succession, despite it only being necessarily, inevitably, a transitional monarchy between one long queen and we assume a long reign for his son. He's been a very effective king, and I think that statement that you've read out is an example of how they realised the necessity of trying to show as clean a pair of hands as possible, and of being above the process, which is tarnishing and tainting the institution. I think his feeling and the feeling of the working royals, who are by and large very popular. We saw the Princess of Wales and the Prince of Wales at the BAFTAs last night, the British Academy of Film and Television Awards, receiving great cheers and great applause. And Princess Anne is by far the most popular royal, always engaging in public activities. They're hoping that the institution can survive this kind of cauterization, this amputation of the individual. And the individual will be seen as the issue rather than the institution. And that's why Republicans I think, are keen to go for the institution and the extent to which Andrew's behavior was known. Their view is it must have been known for so long and at such great extent.
Do you think that this is really inflicting some permanent damage to the monarchy? Because just when we're thinking about history, the last time a royal was arrested, Charles I, the 1600s, that didn't really work out well for him. He ultimately got beheaded. So, what is the damage here for the monarchy? How lasting do you think it is?
Well, that won't happen. I'm pretty sure that won't happen.
No beheading, of course, of course.
Because yeah, one reason why that was a very rare occurrence and why they've managed to withstand the wave of republicanism across Europe and the world, should we say, in the 20th century and 19th century, was they're very adaptable and have an institutional imperative and recognize the importance of the institution continuing. And they've also been lucky. I find it fascinating the way in which, because it's hereditary, it depends on the first male born, as it was. Now it's been modernized into the firstborn, but still hereditary, has been by and large a dutiful and public spirited individual. The one exception was in 1936 when we had Edward VIII, who was clearly unsuited for the role. And the system adapted, despite there being an empire, despite the crisis for the monarchy, the head of state himself abdicating, retiring, resigning. His brother, who wasn't suited and didn't plan to be king, George VI, became king and was the model in many ways for the monarchy as it's been ever since. His father, George V, too, in the First World War, George VI in the Second World War, and with Churchill, with some blending and smoothing of historical facts, which I can go into if you wish, but overall regarded as a dutiful and servicing, man determined to serve to be at the service of the public. As the King's own remarks that you quoted earlier about duty and service, this he instilled into his daughter Elizabeth II. There were no sons, so we had Elizabeth II rather than had George VI had a son. And she absolutely embodied, in the minds of most people, the modern constitutional monarchy of being above and separate from politics, but devoting herself, as people saw, to duty and service. And the king embodies that, as does his son, the Prince of Wales. Andrew, not unlike Edward VIII, is not of that ilk, shall we say. Edward VIII more important because he was king, but Andrew in a much more transparent public age. With Edward VIII rather, the press could be silenced, and they were complicit in much of the suppression of what actually happened. Now there's enormous transparency, and there's much less in the way of the public being prepared to be told things. That's why I think many people have been commenting on this and saying this is not as serious as Diana, it's not as serious as George VIII, Edward VIII rather. I think this is potentially more serious because of the attitude of the public to the institution and to institutions more generally. And the Epstein story, in its broadest sense, reinforces a feeling on the part of voters we've seen across the developed world, which are against institutions, against establishment organizations, suspicious in at margins, moving into conspiracy areas, but the assumption being that people are being misled at the very least, quite possibly lied to by those with a vested interest in denying them information and living a life of gilded international luxury, we say. And this is one reason why I think this has the potential to do so much damage. The public are not as inclined to be convinced as they once were. So the palace has a lot on their hands. But in the form of the next generation, the Prince and Princess of Wales and their children, they have a royal family from central casting. If you wanted to try and deal with the concerns of a modern society, her discussion of her cancer diagnosis, his promotion of mental health problems in men, they're extremely modern, extremely attentive to public interest, and very popular. Kate Middleton, Princess of Wales, is extremely popular. So once again, I'm seeing personally, I'm predicting there to be a transition between the generations, which will be able to accommodate and overcome this crisis. And it is a crisis, and it's a crisis. Many who want to see the end of the monarchy, the Republicans, they hope this can be exacerbated into something much more serious and a more profound discussion about the nature of power in a democracy.
Do people then, to that point, think that King Charles or perhaps that older generation in the monarchy, do they think that they should have said something sooner? Are they happy or content with this statement now that's pretty blunt? I mean, what do they make of that?
It's hard to say. There's no polling on this as yet. One's going anecdotally. The King and the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, have been heckled. They've had questions asked. You know how journalists ask questions very loudly, knowing there won't be an answer, but they get their question on the footage of the person walking past. That never used to happen. So that element of deference, which is a huge part of what's happened with the monarchy, has gone. Most people probably are indifferent to the institution, but not actually hostile. Those who are very positive are a minority. Those who are very hostile are a minority. The majority are broadly indifferent and think on balance it does a good job. And that's why it's so important that it's deemed to have acted very quickly. Those questions are of how much was known before, and rumors come out. You never actually have a proper statement. It's always rumors, and someone said in the palace, and it's passed on through a journalist or a sympathetic royal writer that the king was opposed to Andrew's role. The king had been opposed to the fees being paid for the silencing of Virginia Giuffre and so on. These are all second-hand or third-hand stories, never on the record. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why those who are critical of the institution say that things have to change.
And Andrew was not charged. He was released after about 11 hours, but he wasn't exonerated either. Police were investigating